That's a great question, and we will still be competing globally in the global market. The price point right now is we proved that when the Saudis were almost at complete full production, the OPEC Plus was jamming everything they could into the market in 2019. We still could compete. The shakeout was really interesting, Pedro, because we had over 100 companies go bankrupt that just disappeared. There were mergers and acquisitions, there were assets that were acquired. We've learned unlocking the shale revolution was a very, very expensive proposition for the industry. It was very capital intensive, and we went to the capital markets and they backed us. We broke that code, like I said, and we learned some lessons. I think the industry has very much winnowed itself down and is ready to compete regardless of what the Saudis do.
As far as the current condition, we've heard that the Saudi only has a very limited resources. We heard President Biden say that they're expected for the Saudi government to come forward and help with the production. Where's the reality in either of those?
That was an interesting conversation they had over the weekend. You know, we also learned last week that the Saudis were actually buying Russian fuel oil and it cut through Egypt to power their grid, which is almost exclusively powered by petroleum products. So it's actually cheaper for the Saudis to buy that cheap Russian oil, skirt the sanctions, so to speak, power their own grid, which then frees up their own production to put onto the global market at a higher price.
He's the president of the U.S. Oil and Gas Association. Here to talk about production in the United States. Good morning.
Good morning. It's good to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. As far as the association itself, who does it represent?
So the U.S. Oil and Gas Association is actually the nation's oldest energy trade association. We were formed in 1917 in the middle towards the end of World War I to ensure that petroleum was making it to the U.S. military. Our membership has evolved over the years. We primarily represent, it's all upstream, so the exploration and production companies. Mostly what we have both publicly traded and small companies as well. So we actually represent a really good cross-section of the industry, from those who are working offshore and onshore, federal lands and private lands, publicly traded companies and privately held companies, a lot of the legacy companies. Odds are that if there is a name on a petroleum engineering building somewhere in Oklahoma or Texas, it's a company that was founded by somebody's grandfather who's one of my members.
How would you characterize oil production in the United States as it stands today?
You know, that is a great question. Given where we were 2 years ago and the truly dark days of industry, we have snapped back in an incredibly resilient way. We're very, very encouraged right now. I was looking at the numbers this morning. We have about 250 more rigs in the air than we did last year at this time. It's about 770 rigs, which is almost really full capacity. Odds are that if there's a rig in the United States, it's up in the air right now. Our production numbers are starting to come up. We're facing some interesting challenges that we hadn't faced in the past, which is we're feeling the significant impacts of inflation. But we're doing great, I think. We're in a much better situation than we were in April of 2020 when we were underwater by $32 a barrel.
Was that strictly because of COVID, or were there other factors there?
So that, a little history on that. If you recall, pre-COVID, the Saudis and the Russians declared war on the U.S. shale industry and really, really flooded the market. They ramped up production significantly to drive the price of global oil down below that breaking point for the shale producers. The shale producers responded in kind. So that was that sort of petro wars that was underway, and then COVID hit, and that led to an incredibly and unseen demand collapse. I don't know about you, but I only put gas in my car once over the course of a 3-month period during those first 2 months of COVID. So those were the dark days. That's what led to that overproduction, overstorage capacity, no use, and that's really what led to the numbers being what they were. We've since come back from that, so that's the good news for everybody.
As far as numbers, I think most people will take a look at how much it costs to fill their cars with gasoline these days. How much is that attributed to as far as the amount of production being done and what's being refined here in the United States?
So that's a great question. We get asked that all the time. The cost of a gallon of gasoline, only about 60% of that is crude, the cost of crude itself. Another about 20% is the cost of refining and transportation and distribution. Then on top of that, you have the state and the federal and local taxes, and then what is left is the margin for the retailer. So yeah, obviously the cost of crude has had an impact on the rising gas prices. The challenge is, as the demand significantly increased faster than ramping up that production from those dark days of 2020, we've not been able to catch up to that. The other challenge, obviously, and you hear a lot about this, is the impact on the refining capacity that we've had, whereas some of those refineries came offline and have not come back online. It's this accordion or elastic effect where we haven't quite hit that balance just yet.
Tim Stewart is with us, and if you want to ask him questions about the oil and gas industry, the role he serves, and particularly what it does as far as production in the United States, you can do so on the lines 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, and Independents 202-748-8002. You can also text us at 202-748-8003. I don't know if you saw this, but on the Sunday shows, the president's chief energy advisor was on talking about what he sees as the future of gas prices. Not only does he talk about overseas issues, but he talks about the role of oil producers that they may serve. I want you to listen a little bit of what he had to say and comment on it.
All right.
There's no doubt there's never one reason why oil prices go up or why oil goes down. As you know, when oil prices go up, they tend to say there's only one reason, that's the political leadership. But if you think about it this way, over the last few months, the president has supplied the U.S. market with 1 million barrels a day, which is a historic level.
From the Strategic
Petroleum Reserve. We've never done that before.
And that, what, ends in September?
No, that will end towards the end of the year.
Will it end towards the end of the year? Can you afford to stop putting emergency supply on the market?
Well, look at what has happened. The private sector, as we talked to them in the United States, said they can increase production in the United States by about 1 million barrels a day, but it's going to take time to invest in it. It'll come at the end of the year. So we stepped in, the president stepped in and said, I'll fill that gap.
Right.
So hopefully my expectation is that the private sector in the U.S. will have those increases coming so we don't need to have the emergency from the U.S. government.
Mr. Stewart, how would you respond to how we characterize the private sector's role in this?
Private sector obviously plays a critical role. The challenge when you tap the Strategic Petroleum Reserve for that high of a degree for that long is it still disrupts the production process in the U.S. It puts 1 million barrels a day, 1 million barrels actually into the system, which then obviously has an impact on prices, but also impacts the ability for the producers to figure out and the futures market to predict what goes forward. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is interesting. I actually worked on that when I was on the Hill way back in the 90s. And there was a time when Congress was seriously considering to privatize the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and turn it over to industry and let industry run it because industry had a better feel of where markets were going to be 6 months from now. I would suggest that it is used primarily for an emergency. From the industry's perspective, we wish they would have come to us and said, ramp up, give us an extra 1 million barrels any way you can, and we will do everything we can to remove the obstacles to help you do that. It is still, it obviously hasn't had the impact on prices that they thought it was. They did this in November and prices still went up. They then did the major release in March and prices still went up. So it doesn't solve the issue of increasing domestic production.
So when you hear him say that the private industry could probably come forward and help with this process, are there still obstacles in the way?
There are plenty of obstacles in the way, yeah. Obviously, there's a regulatory regimen whenever you're doing work on federal lands, onshore and offshore. Those obstacles still remain in place. We think there was an opportunity the administration had, and we still are open to them coming to us and saying, let's look at the critical infrastructure. Let's look at the expedited permitting. Let's see what we can do to make sure that we don't find ourselves in this situation where there's a global price shock like we've had. You know, a couple years ago, people don't realize this, when we were at the shale peak, and if you recall that the Saudi production facilities were droned by the Yemenis, nobody registered that because the U.S. Producers had so filled that global market that it was a price shock that never actually materialized. We can do things like that again.
Tim Stewart of the U.S. Oil and Gas Association with us. Our first call for you comes from Richmond, Virginia. This is Bill, Independent Line. You're on with our guest. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. Mr. Stewart, I have 2 quick questions for you this morning. Will you please explain finally the difference between the Keystone Pipeline and the Keystone XL, and whether or not President Biden actually shut down either one of those pipelines? Thank you, sir.
Bill, that's a great question. You know, and that's the one that seems to catch everybody's attention because it was an action that was taken on the very first day of the administration. You know, pipeline infrastructure in North America is a very, very complex thing, and Keystone XL really are basically part of the same system. And what was needed was that essentially that last segment to be approved to get it from the Canadian down to the Gulf, to Oklahoma and then down to the Gulf where that crude could be refined. The administration came in and put a hold on all of the remaining permitting and essentially killed the project because of the time delay that would take place. Essentially, they said we're not going to do it while we're in office. So it's a 4 or possibly 8-year delay. And so essentially that was a signal, kind of a troubling signal to our closest trading partner that we weren't going to participate with them. And so it had ramifications not just for the pipeline itself, but for broader energy infrastructure and potential investment in those projects going forward. That's why you hear industry talk an awful lot about we're worried about being debanked or the infrastructure not being funded.
And just to clarify, the XL pipeline would have increased capacity for many of years if it were to go forward.
Yeah, it would have taken, again, like any infrastructure, it would have taken several years to complete. But the reality is the oil markets globally, as we mentioned earlier, think to the future, and that extra supply bringing balance to the North American portfolio was really, really important. Now the Canadians don't have an option to send it to the U.S., so they send it to China or somewhere else in Asia.
From Dover, Delaware, Jay, Democrats line, hi.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I'm in my late 70s. I've been through this before. I read 2 newspapers a day and try to check out everything that we're told. Sir, I can't believe you are still saying that, oh, it's all regulation, and oh, we didn't get enough leases, and oh, it's the Keystone Pipeline. There are people who believe you, but a lot of us don't because of the absolutely obscene profits you've been making, and because you still insist that everything is the fault of the government who didn't give you everything you want. Do you want to try to do a better job with that?
So specifically, what question would you like to ask our guest?
Wrong.
Caller, what would you like to ask our guest specifically?
I'm asking him when they're going to stop blaming the government and the Keystone Pipeline loss, which, by the way, was an option to sell us the oil, not guaranteed, which was not going to do much for us because of that. Okay. How many times do you think we can go through this? Please explain.
Okay. You asked the question. We'll let our guest answer.
Look, the callers obviously expresses the frustrations that millions of people feel. And I think my response is our industry functions largely independent, particularly in the private sector, largely independent of significant government subsidy or support one way or the other. I think, and again, that I understand the frustration because that has been sort of the political back and forth, the narrative, the argument that we've been under for the last 18 months, and it wasn't always this way. If you go back even 4 or 8 years ago, it was a fairly quiet time in industry. We had our disagreements, but we had the tendency to work around each other, work with each other, with the federal government. But most of my members of my trade association, these small companies, don't actually deal an awful lot with the federal government, but they deal a lot with the global markets. And so the concern I think they have is just kind of get out of our way, let us do what we were doing quietly 4 years or 8 years ago, and we can produce a product and bring down prices.
The president sent a letter to oil executives earlier this year, and in part he wrote this: the last time the price of crude oil was about $120 per barrel in March, the price of gas at the pump was $4.25 per gallon. Today, gas prices are 75 cents higher, and this is going back in time a little bit. Diesel prices are 90 cents higher. The difference of more than 15% of the pump is the result of the historically high profit margins for refining oil into gasoline, diesel, and other refined products. Since the beginning of the year, refiners' margins for refining gasoline and diesel have tripled and are currently at their highest levels ever recorded. Is the president right?
President, this goes to our ongoing criticism with he and his administration, which is we make the argument that they only view half of the actual problem, and they don't give credit to the markets or to the way that we actually do our business. This has been a criticism. I don't know if it's fair or not, but the number of people that came out of our industry that work in the administration who really understand oil and gas production, you can probably count on one hand. they don't have an awful lot of advisors there who can come in and say to the messaging team, yes, but. And that, I think, is a challenge. And to their credit, the people who do understand the industry, they work hard to try and bring that balance. At times they get run over from the White House messaging team. So I think our industry responded to that letter, and we said yes, but, and laid out the other reasons why we were facing the pricing climate that we are. And nobody is completely free of fault here, neither the administration nor the industry. The reality is we were put in some significant constraints. We didn't respond in time like we could. The other challenge is we couldn't get the financing that we'd hoped in time and matter as well.
As far as the yes is concerned, yes, you are making high profits.
We're making high profits, and we're also paying record prices. I think I mentioned this just earlier. You know, it's really interesting. We are making record profits. In a historical context, 2008 was actually a higher pricing environment when you factor in the inflationary factors. But we're also paying record prices for everything from labor costs to pipe to the crews that we bring in to frac sand. And so I think what you're seeing is our record profits also reflected in the record prices that our industry and everybody else is paying.
Let's hear from Ken in Pennsylvania, Republican line. Hi, you're next up.
Yes, good morning. Seems to me that Trump filled up all the oil reserves, and Biden's emptying them all. So we're going to have to vote Trump back in to fill them back up.
You know, Ken, I'm glad you raised that because we were talking earlier about the collapse during COVID and how the prices went actually underwater for a matter of hours. At that time, when they were negotiating the COVID package, the COVID relief package, the emergency package, one of the ideas was if oil is trading at $11 or $12 a barrel, let's invest $3 billion and completely fill it up to the whole 757 million barrel capacity, because it will never be cheaper than it is right now. And that proposal was sent to the Hill, and unfortunately the Democrats didn't agree to that. That was a really big missed opportunity, because when you have an extra 100 million barrels at $14 a barrel, that's a pretty good deal for the American taxpayer. It's a missed opportunity. I wish we would have done that.
Tim Stewart of the U.S. Oil and Gas Association joining us. We've heard a lot about the topic of oil leases. Can you walk us through what happens when a company requires an oil lease and what they do with it?
Right. That is a great question. We field that all the time. And I summarize, I say, look, an oil lease is no guarantee for anything. It's not like buying a six-pack at the convenience store. It's not a guarantee for 6 12-ounce cans of something. When a company secures a lease, it is the equivalent of saying we are securing the right to make a very, very big bet that may or may not pay out. That's all it is. It really is. It's a gamble. You're making an educated guess on a parcel of land that may or may not have resources, and you don't know until you get into it. The leasing process is very, very long and very, very complicated. It actually starts before the lease. It starts with when a company or an individual come to the Bureau of Land Management and issue what's called an expression of interest, an EOI. And they say, we think this 4,000 acres in Wyoming, we're interested in it. And so the Bureau of Land Management takes that and takes their land managers, and they go through a fairly rigorous pre-leasing process, about 10 different steps or so, to determine if the parcel actually even qualifies, let alone if it has resource underneath. And it's everything from, do we actually even own the surface, or do we own the minerals, to is it in a city boundary, or does it fit within a wilderness area or something like that. So the BLM's experts go through and they take all those expressions of interest and package them together and put forward in a quarterly lease sale. As a company, I may have expressed that interest. I may not actually secure the lease because I have to still go bid on it. But let's say that I go bid on it and I acquire it. That then becomes a very, very rigorous environmental process by which I have to go in and I have to present my drilling plan, my plan of production to the Bureau of Land Management. I have to comply with numerous federal laws and NEPA requirements. That documentation can sometimes take years. And we have to record everything from the archaeological surveys to wildlife stipulation impacts and things like that. That's a process in and of itself. The pre-leasing, the pre-production process is very, very rigorous. And then I seek for an application for a permit to drill an APD. And all the time the BLM is processing all of this paperwork, these permits. And this takes anywhere from 6 months to 5, 7, 10 years sometimes. And so it's a very, very challenging process. In the meantime, all of my capital is locked up into this project, either the lease or the rental payments that I'm paying or the environmental work that I'm paying for, to the attorney's fees before I can even get a rig on the ground. And so I'm burning capital while I'm waiting for a lease. So when the administration says, and the criticism of our industry, well, you've got 9,000 leases that you're not using, and our response back is, well, we've got 4,500 of those leases we're waiting for you to approve us on. And the other 4,500 are probably waiting on that approval for that first 4,500, excuse me. That's where we're at in this process.
Let's hear from New York. This is on our independent line. This is Dave. Hello.
Hey, good morning. I just want to say I live in basically suburbia. I grew up in suburbia, and that's where I live. Hey, and so when, as far as, you know, everywhere, anything I have to do, I have to get in the car, I have to drive, I have to pay for gas. So I remember after 2008, there was like, you know, the big financial crisis, and there was a big spike in gas prices, but the interest rates came slamming down, and that's when the fracking started to blow up, right? And fracking, I remember at one point it was like $80 a barrel, which made it profitable, and then supposedly they brought it down. But like when you said, when Russia and Saudi Arabia attacked the fracking industry and really slammed prices down, the fracking industry really used the cheap debt. So you use those low manipulated interest rates that the Fed put in to continue fracking. And what that did is it kind of, so at one point everybody was buying, you know, a 4-cylinder car cheap to get around. And then as time progressed, everybody fell away from that and went back to, you know, the big giant trucks, SUVs, everything in suburbia. So what I'm saying now is, what happened is, are we ever going to get back to, did fracking just burn up all that cheap fuel? And it really, in the long term, is suburbia, is this like a big mistake, this whole suburban lifestyle? I mean,
okay.
do we really?
Yeah, we got you, Dave. We got you. Thank you.
Dave, you know, that's a great question. And honestly, you articulated it really well, the circumstances in 2008. The irony in high gasoline prices is it actually, high oil prices, is it actually increases the number of reserves that we have. Because the way that industry operates, you know, we have proven reserves at a particular price point. And so when we were cracking the code on the shale plays, like you mentioned, in 2008, and interest rates made the capitalization of those very capital-intensive projects made them possible. The price point on oil was hitting in that 50 to 60 to make these shale plays profitable. If we remain above 90 or $100 a barrel, we've got proven and probable reserves that all of a sudden we have tens of billions of more barrels of oil that are actually financially feasible. None of us really want that. For the consumer's perspective, our industry really, a high and a volatile price climate is not ideal for us because we've got to capitalize over the long term. So Dave, to your point, those low interest rates and really allowed for the industry to crack the code on these shale plays in half a dozen different places in the United States. And each shale play is different. They're not the identical in terms of how you go in and produce. The Haynesville Shale is very different than the Barnett Shale, for example, or the Bakken, for example. So I would say ultimately don't bet against the industry. To the issue of the suburban lifestyle, that's a long-term transition that will take place. I can't bet on what that's going to be like in 20 or 30 years, but I would say that our industry will be around for a long, long time.
The administration's pushing things like electric vehicles and things like that. How is the industry looking forward to that if people are going to rely less on petroleum-based products? So
the unknown fact is really interesting because there's odds are that if I plug in my electric vehicle anywhere in the United States, there's a 41% chance that I'm going to be charging that vehicle using natural gas. Another 22% chance I'm using coal. And so ironically, we're shifting the transportation use of from actual vehicles to charging of those vehicles. And from the industry's perspective, on natural gas, for example, we're agnostic with regards to how it's actually used. If it's used for baseload power consumption, that's great. If it's used for something else. But it's a long transition, and I think we're learning right now, and the Europeans are learning right now, that if you're moving rapidly towards a transformation of your transportation sector, you darn well better be ready to have something in place to receive it.
Here is from Trenton, Florida, Charlie, Democrats line. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I was wondering if you could fill in the timeline of the situation that we find ourselves in. Like when there was a lot of talk about the oncoming inflation, from Joe Manchin and why he wanted to stop Build Back Better, and then having the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and knowing that there was going to be a need for all kinds of petroleum resources for Europe, as well as everyone getting over COVID and being ready to get back driving and doing everything. I wonder how long did it really take to use the rigs that were already there and ready to go? Why did he have to what kind of percentage of the inflation do you think that the petroleum industry is responsible for?
Charlie, that's a good question, and I think if you look at where the CPI and the PPI numbers are, obviously energy is a big portion of that right now. And that's not just for gasoline, for crude oil, but it's also for electricity production and other things. If I could take you back to 18 months ago when the Biden administration first came in, industry was slowly ramping up. They were coming out of the pandemic impact, and we were actually bringing more rigs and crews online. We still were finding trouble with workforce and supply chain constraints, just like everybody else. And as we're trying to ramp up, the administration came in and made it very clear very early on that it was their intent to force a transformation, particularly in the capital markets. And what that did is that had sort of a chilling effect on our ability to raise capital for these projects that are going forward right now. I was talking with a small investment firm out of Denver a couple weeks ago. They're actually here in Washington. Two really, really bright women who had started a venture capital fund. And normally, and this is for the oil and gas industry, normally they'd go out, identify a project, go out for the raise, and they'd make 50 or 60 presentations to be able to raise the small amount of capital. They found themselves last summer at this time having to make over 300 presentations before they could actually get to hit their target. And the reason being is there was so much uncertainty for that first year of the administration with regards to where we were going with, where the administration is going with regards to the oil and gas industry. Unfortunately, then the inflationary pressures, the global events caught up, and they have since realized we play an important role, and they have backed off on that, but it still remains a threat, and I think it still has, like I say, a chilling effect on our projects being financed.
Earlier in early July, the Interior Secretary proposed a new round of leases, or at least a proposal, in part saying the proposed plan puts forward several options for no lease sales from up to 11 lease sales over the next 5 years. Like the current program finalized in 2016, it removes from consideration the federal waters off the Atlantic and Pacific coast while inviting public comment on 10 potential sales in the Gulf of Mexico and one in the Cook Inlet off of South Central Alaska. What would this do as far as production is concerned?
So that was for the offshore lease sales. The Secretary, in the 5-year plan, which they technically had to have in place by the 30th of June, they were a few days late getting the draft out. So they actually are very much behind. They're about 18 months behind. The Trump administration, as those 5-year plans are rolled forward through administrations, the Trump administration had actually proposed about 48 lease sales offshore. They had dialed that back, and we're waiting to see if this was going to come with somewhere in that 20 to 30 range. The administration then, in the first part of July, came out and said, well, our draft plan calls for anywhere from 11 to no lease sales. The offshore resource in the Gulf of Mexico is astounding. There's one shell project, the Perdido project, which is an engineering marvel in and of itself. 8,000 feet down to the sea floor, 200 miles offshore, 8,000 feet down, several thousand feet under the ground to get the resource. 33 wells that extend in a 30-mile diameter, produces 100,000 barrels a day. It is a massive project. It also requires a massive amount of capitalization. And when you're putting billions of dollars on the table, you need to have an assurity that the leases are going to be made available to you before you make that investment, obviously, but then that you're going to have the ability to get it out. I think, unfortunately, the Department of Interior has missed an opportunity here because the draft hasn't made it quite palatable yet to industry to sink those billions of dollars into the markets. If they were to come and say we had 25 leases, we're going to have you take a look, the lease sales, we're going to have you take a look at it, I think they'd be much more interested. Now it limits it strictly to just a handful of players who can invest that much capital.
We're talking with Tim Stewart. He's the president of the U.S. Oil and Gas Association. Here is Angela in West Palm Beach, Florida, independent line. Hi.
Hi there. What I'm wondering, since this is a complicated issue, like most issues in life, right? What efforts is Mr. Stewart making to put out information that a lot of Americans are not aware of? For example, just give you one example, and then I'll listen. That the way oil and gas are retrieved in the U.S., probably more careful, more eco-friendly than the way that happens in other countries. But there's lots more to tell, and I'm just wondering how Mr. Stewart is getting that information out, and then I'll listen.
Angela, that is the criticism of my industry that I hear over and over again from people. I hear it from church, I hear them at church, I hear them, in my neighborhood, I hear it from C-SPAN. And so I will be the first to admit that we, despite all of our best efforts, still struggle to give a good message out there. The reality is, and you hit on a really good point, which is that a barrel of oil produced in the United States is the cleanest barrel of oil anywhere in the world. Using North Dakota, for example, the state of North Dakota requires that 96% of all emissions are captured when we're producing a barrel of oil in North Dakota. You don't find that in Saudi Arabia, you don't find that in Venezuela or anywhere else that's doing that. The reality is, I remember early on in my career when I was working on an issue in Utah, on public lands in Utah, on an oil lease, and we sat down and we counted the number of state and federal and local laws that a company needed to comply with before they could begin producing. It was 127 at the time. And so that is a very, very rigorous legal and environmental criteria that the industry has to make. We do produce energy cleaner than anywhere else in the world. And to Angela's point, we are just not good sometimes at telling our story. So I appreciate the opportunity to tell that story right now.
A viewer from Twitter, with the president just back from Saudi Arabia, she asked, what happens to U.S. oil when Saudi Arabia shale production is up and running?
That's a great question, and we will still be competing globally in the global market. The price point right now is we proved that when the Saudis were almost at complete full production, the OPEC Plus was jamming everything they could into the market in 2019. We still could compete. The shakeout was really interesting, Pedro, because we had over 100 companies go bankrupt that just disappeared. There were mergers and acquisitions, there were assets that were acquired. We've learned unlocking the shale revolution was a very, very expensive proposition for the industry. It was very capital intensive, and we went to the capital markets and they backed us. We broke that code, like I said, and we learned some lessons. I think the industry has very much winnowed itself down and is ready to compete regardless of what the Saudis do.
As far as the current condition, we've heard that the Saudi only has a very limited resources. We heard President Biden say that they're expected for the Saudi government to come forward and help with the production. Where's the reality in either of those?
That was an interesting conversation they had over the weekend. We also learned last week that the Saudis were actually buying Russian fuel oil and through Egypt to power their grid, which is almost exclusively powered by petroleum products. So it's actually cheaper for the Saudis to buy that cheap Russian oil, skirt the sanctions, so to speak, power their own grid, which then frees up their own production to put onto the global market at a higher price. I don't think the president accomplished what he wanted to do, and frankly, there were some warning signals early on coming from the Saudis and the Emiratis and others that we're not going to be able to deliver what you ask for. Plus, there are also, I think, some mismanagement of that relationship. You can't call somebody a pariah state and then expect them to do you a favor shortly thereafter.
Larry is in Fort Washington, Maryland, Democrats line for our guest. Larry, good morning.
Yes, I worked for the federal government in energy modeling, and we used to have a model that modeled all the refinery industry production and its pipelines and its shipments. And it gave us an insight into the total industry for the U.S. And it helped the government to have an idea of what would be happening if production was lost and all of that. But when I would give presentations to the industry, they scoffed on it and they wanted it out. so that we didn't have the insight. And so when the administration changed from Democrat to Republicans, all of that knowledge in this modeling went out of the federal government, which gave federal government very little insight into what the oil companies do. Only insight they have is what the oil companies tell the federal government, this is what we'll do. And that's a very bad situation for a nation that depends on the oil industry to propel its economy. And it's because some things are in the interest of the American people that may not be profitable for the oil companies at a certain level. But at least when you had the model and you had a method of conversation back and forth between the industry and the federal government. But that's gone, so the federal government is pretty much blind to what the oil company does now.
Okay, that's Larry in Maryland. Thank you, Larry.
You know, Larry, 80% of inspiration is based on good information, and I don't disagree with you that there have been periods when there has not been good communication between the industry and the federal government. We rely heavily upon the Energy Information Agency for their information, for their modeling, and I think this refining capacity challenge that we're faced is actually a good point to Larry's point, which is obviously there's been a breakdown at some point between our ability to fully predict and prepare for. The problem sometimes is that you can see something coming down the road, but you can't find the ability to address it in your present date. And I think that's probably where the refining industry was at. We were warning about this back in November and October of last year, that the signs in the inventories are not looking good, and it was a little bit too late for us to react quickly to it.
We have a question on the production side. This is from Stephen in Michigan saying, how can you ensure that another Deepwater Horizon doesn't happen?
Our industry, again, nobody wants another Deepwater Horizon. And after that, we actually learned lessons and learned additional lessons with regards to our well safety and the operations that we do. Multiple redundancies were put into place. It's like anything. You always knock on wood that something like that doesn't happen. But I think shortly after that incident in 2008, 2009, the industry responded. We worked well with the Obama administration to put additional redundancies in place. And if we maintain our rigorous standards like we do offshore, then I think we're in a good shape. Again, nobody wants that to happen. From the industry's perspective, that is such a huge impact on our ability to do our job. An accident like that is a loss of billions and billions and billions of dollars, and so it is in our interest not to have something like that happen.
As far as the next 6 months or so, where do you see the industry going, and what's the message to those who still may be skeptical about the role you play, particularly as far as representing the industry?
So I actually split time between Washington, D.C. and the family farm out in Utah. And I was talking to a friend of mine, a guy named Mike Spackman. He's a farmer. He runs about 4,000 acres. Not a huge operation. I was talking to him earlier this spring. And I was saying, Mike, how you doing? He looked at me and goes, Tim, I'm paying $5,000 a week to keep diesel in the tractors. And you're in the oil and gas industry. How do you think things are going? And again, our industry's response to this. The worst case scenario for us is a demand collapse. To have have people stop using our product. That doesn't solve our problem at all. So we can do what we can do, which is to get as much supply into the system, make sure that we're doing it in a safe and environmentally friendly way, giving the refiners and the manufacturers and the agricultural industry plenty of options for product available. And do it at a price point where it's affordable. You know, the industry, the best place, when somebody says how high is too high of gas prices, my response is it's too high when you can't afford to put gas in your car. No, we don't want that. And so I think where we're going 6 months from now, I think you'll, again, depending on what happens globally, but in the U.S. side, the production numbers are going to be up. If we can adjust our refining capacity and the global refining capacity comes back on, I think we're going to see a more comfortable pricing environment. I hope so.
The website for the organization is usoga.org. Tim Stewart, the president of U.S. Oil and Gas Association. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Coming up next, we're going to talk with Washington Post opinion writer Paul Waldman. He'll talk about Campaign 2022, political news of the day.